On April 23, 1961, Judy Garland performed a program of 26 jazz standards, musical theater hits, and songs from her filmography for an audience of over 3,000 people. The concert was recorded for Capitol Records and released as a live album later that year. The event, as preserved by the hit record, has subsequently been dubbed the greatest night in entertainment history. It was, wrote music editor of Radio TV Mirror Don Mills, a triumphant tour de force that should be on every record shelf of every follower of show business. Her dynamism, coupled with the contagion of the audience, makes this album a vibrant, never-to-be-forgotten experience. A chorus of other critics agreed. Now, the greatest night in entertainment history is quite a label. A good PR tagline for sure. But could it possibly be true? Did Judy Garland give one of the best concerts of all time that night? In this video, I'm going to do a deep dive on Judy at Carnegie Hall, what led up to it, what she sang, how she sang it, and the legacy that the album still carries to this day. Before we get started, I want to give a huge thanks to Mubi for sponsoring this video. Mubi is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from around the globe, and you can get a whole month free at mubi.com/BeKindRewind. According to her biographer, Gerald Clark, Judy Garland called 1961 the best year of her life. The year marked a shift in the tide, when misfortunes finally seemed to stop piling up and professional successes took their place. And she needed it. The 1950s had been a particularly tumultuous time. She parted ways with her home studio of 15 years, MGM, and although she had found critical success with 1954's A Star is Born, the production was plagued with difficulties, indicating the troubles she'd experienced with her mental health and substance abuse at MGM had followed her beyond the studio's gates. Her personal life didn't fare much better either. She filed twice for divorce against her husband, Sid Luft, although that wouldn't be official for a few years yet. Luft had developed a gambling habit that quickly drained her bank account of any money she made performing, and by 1956, they owed about $21,000 to the IRS in back taxes. The press painstakingly chronicled the couple's money problems, like in 1958 when she failed to appear in a New York court to settle her tax bills, was placed under civil arrest, and was forced to surrender $10,000 worth of costumes and jewelry when she couldn't afford to pay her bond. And that was just the beginning of her legal battles. CBS abruptly canceled a 3-year exclusive deal with Garland to produce television specials. Stories like these piled up, and by 1958, the narrative around her was clear. Judy Garland, the little girl with the big voice, whose life pattern resembles that of a yo-yo, has plummeted to the nadir of the downbeat once again. Keep in mind that during all of this, she was still working. She maintained a rigorous schedule of concert performances throughout the 1950s, very well-reviewed concerts, in fact. For example, she played 19 consecutive weeks at the Palace Theater in New York City, and won praise for a 7-night run at the Metropolitan Opera, with 14 standing ovations in one night, and rave reviews from critics. Louis Finke in the New York Times wrote, "That magnetism that she always has managed to exert upon the audience is as powerful as ever. The smooth voice that comes from deep down continues to stir the emotions and set an audience on the edge of its seat." Still, the chaos of the past few years finally took its toll, and in November 1959, Garland was taken to the hospital in New York City, where she was diagnosed with acute hepatitis, likely caused or exacerbated by her chronic substance abuse issues. She lay in bed for 7 weeks, having fluids drained from her body, and was eventually discharged in January 1960. Her illness forced her, for the first time in a long time, to pause. Gerald Clark writes, "During her months of enforced inactivity, Judy had had time, as well as reason, to look closely, perhaps for the first time, at who she was and where she was going. She decided to leave Los Angeles for London, feeling that she could better revive herself away from the judgmental, busy hub of show business. Her health improved rapidly, and before long, she was back giving concerts, sounding better than ever before. A run at the Palladium in London in August 1960 was a rousing success, and things only seemed to improve from there. One of the first major changes, Luft was replaced as Garland's business manager by Freddie Fields, a talent agent who had just started his own agency and was looking to build a small but mighty list of prominent clientele. Fields believed he could harness Judy's newfound energy to stage a comeback and began enacting a plan to completely rehabilitate her image throughout 1961. First, in January of that year, it was announced that Garland had nabbed a role in Stanley Kramer's Judgment at Nuremberg. Irene Hoffman would be a small but crucial role, a good fit for the actress readjusting to life on set after 6 years away from cinema. The role wouldn't require learning any complex choreography or music. She didn't carry the pressure of being a lead, and it demonstrated her dramatic range in a way her musical comedies normally didn't. Success in that role could open the door to new opportunities down the line. Concerts were, of course, also part of the plan, so Fields arranged a 16-city tour throughout the United States that would end at Carnegie Hall in New York City. Garland selected and ordered the songs herself and hired Mort Lindsay as the musical director and conductor for the tour, who Barbra Streisand fans might recognize as the musical director of A Happening in Central Park. Although some arrangements were recycled from previous albums, Lindsay's contributions should not be understated. The arrangements at the band are no small part of why the album succeeds the way it does, which we'll hear more about later. Fields and Garland also intentionally stripped away extravagant or showy elements from the show. Many of Garland's previous concerts were more like musical variety shows, complete with multiple costume changes, sets, and supporting acts. For example, her show at the Metropolitan Opera featured comedian Alan King, a supporting group of singers and dancers, as well as costumes recalling her film roles. The idea for the new tour was to let Judy shine. No dancers, no gimmicks. Gone are the male chorus line and the comedians, the tramp costume, the tux, and the top hat bit. There would just be one costume change at intermission. The sheath, the Mandarin effect of the first act, replaced by black slacks and a blouse in the second, Variety's review of the Carnegie Hall concert later stated, adding that the costuming gave her unusual mobility and she used it to advantage. With the hand mic, she pranced and skipped around the stage, heightening her singing with the aura of complete physical joy. Although there's obviously no video recording of the actual concert, Judy did perform many of the songs on the set list on television throughout the 1960s, offering a hint of what it might have been like to watch her that night. I believe she's even wearing the same costume she wore at Carnegie Hall in the television special shot right after the concert, and the commentary about her mobility really does check out. She fills a ton of space dancing and skipping around. Audiences would find, they hoped, that Garland's voice and physicality alone could sustain a show. And they did. In February 1961, with a brief break to film Judgment at Nuremberg, the tour began. These shows, in cities like Birmingham and San Francisco, began Judy's comeback in earnest, as she impressed local paper after local paper with her performances. These readers were all aware of the ups and downs, mostly downs, Judy had faced over the past decade, and that context framed how they perceived her work. So, for example, this review of her stop in Buffalo literally listed off every low point in her life over the past decade or so, but emphatically followed it up with, any doubts that her followers may have had that she could climb to the top again were quashed this week in Buffalo. At Kleinhand's Music Hall, Judy Garland received the greatest ovation I have ever seen or heard any artist receive when she reached the conclusion of her 2-hour one-woman show. As another paper put it, has Judy Garland health problems, marital problems, weight problems, career problems? Nobody in Dallas Music Hall Monday night could have cared less. This, finally, was the Judy everyone knew, recognized, and loved. The stage for her comeback was set. The success of this tour gave Judy's record label, Capitol Records, the confidence that a live album recorded at the tour's final stop, Carnegie Hall, would be worth the effort. Live albums had sold well for other artists in the past. Billie Holiday had recorded a live album at Carnegie Hall in 1956 to promote her autobiography, Lady Sings the Blues. Ella Fitzgerald had recently recorded one in West Berlin that earned her a pair of Grammys. And so, Judy was given the green light for her own live recording. A rumor circulated for many years that Capitol Records only wanted to do a Carnegie Hall album because it was so hard to get Judy into the studio to fulfill her contractual recording obligations that they basically gave up and just decided to catch her performing the set live. But that's not the case. She had already successfully recorded 2 full albums with them over the course of a year. That's Entertainment, released in 1960, and The London Sessions, also recorded in 1960 while she was living in London, but that had yet to be released. As Will Friedwald writes in his book, The Great Jazz and Pop Vocal Albums, Capitol held back on releasing the British material as they had realized that a live album from Carnegie Hall was a possibility. And so, on Sunday, April 23rd, 1961, a crowd of 3,165 people took their seats at Carnegie Hall. Judy knew how to milk an audience, Mort Lindsay told Vanity Fair in 2011. I see her standing in the wings. She's not doing anything, just looking across the stage. She's looking at me and I'm looking at her. I look in the audience and there's Ethel Merman and Rock Hudson and Benny Goodman. All these big shots sitting down in the first row, waiting and waiting. Is she going to come out? Is she going to do it? But she knows what she's doing. Finally, she gives me a nod, and I start the overture. If you're a fan of Judy Garland, I can't imagine a better overture to hype you up for the show than this one. It's a lovely orchestration, weaving together arguably her 3 most famous songs: the Trolley Song from Meet Me in St. Louis, Over the Rainbow from The Wizard of Oz, and The Man That Got Away from A Star Is Born. Each of these songs are later played in the concert, so I won't go into too much depth about them here. But needless to say, their overture certainly does its job, and by the time Judy Garland actually took the stage at about 8:45 p.m., the audience is audibly thrilled and prepared for the show. The track ends with lengthy applause before Garland immediately launches into her first song of the evening. The concert really begins with When You're Smiling, The Whole World Smiles at You, written by Mark Fisher, Joe Goodwin, and Larry Shea, who was musical director at MGM in the 1930s. Originally written in 1928, the song had become a popular standard by 1961, performed by anyone and everyone you can imagine, although it became most associated with Louis Armstrong.
When you smiling,
Garland's arrangement takes a quicker tempo.
When you're smiling, when you're smiling, the whole world.
But more significantly, what differentiates her version is the inclusion of a patter section, a short comedic interlude written specifically for her by Roger Edens, her mentor and singing coach at MGM, who provided additional music and lyrics for her throughout her career, many examples of which appear on this album. With Edens' new lyrics, she lists a series of scenarios that might get a person down, but follows each up with an encouraging note. If you're deceived, she sings, don't get peeved.
If your husband bluntly tells you you're too stout, don't you pout.
This new section, though brief, establishes some of the basic themes that recur throughout the concert. First, it is unabashedly theatrical. As Friedwald points out, Garland's opening salvo makes it clear that she comes from a theatrical background rather than a jazz or big band one. A majority of her arrangements don't read merely as new orchestrations of standards. They read more like theatrical adaptations of standards. A single song will vary in tone and tempo, as we'll see in songs like Stormy Weather, or include new lyrics to give more of a narrative arc, as is the case here. But they're usually tailored to give Garland an opportunity to more explicitly act a song rather than straightforwardly sing it. That acting brings us to the second thing this section does. It reminds us that Judy Garland is, specifically, a musical comedy entertainer. Listening to the section is sufficient to understand that she's hamming it up and really going for the laugh here. But later television performances give us some clues as to what she might have actually done on the stage.
If your husband bluntly tells you you're too stout, don't you pout.
The new lyrics give her a platform to do this kind of acting, in a way that performing the standard as written wouldn't have. The jokes she actually makes point to the third and final function of the new section. It would have been impossible to be a fan, casual or otherwise, of Judy Garland and not read these lyrics as a meta-commentary on Garland's own life. Many songs throughout the album carry a double meaning, at once standards and subtextual references to the singer's complicated and public life. Sometimes the references will come in the form of self-deprecating humor, as she does here. For example, the line about being stout. Garland's weight had been a topic of conversation virtually from the minute she began acting. MGM constantly pressured her behind the scenes to lose weight and assigned her unhealthy methods to ensure that she did. Throughout the late 1950s, she gained weight for various reasons, not insignificantly the hepatitis that made her body physically unable to process excess fluids, and seemingly no one could write an article about her without mentioning it. Louis Fuenke wrote in his review of her concert at the Metropolitan Opera, for example, that she was clearly in a desperate battle with calories. Another wrote of that performance that she was so bulky it was startling. A vast majority of the reviews of her 1961 tour include similar commentary, monitoring how she'd trimmed down a bit since her last appearance. The word plump was used a lot, as of course was stout. So when Judy Garland gets up on stage to sing with a smile on her face, slapping her own waist,
If your husband bluntly tells you you're too stout, don't you pout. And for
the audience recognizes the joke as extremely personal, laughs, and claps. She has acknowledged a kind of in-joke, creating a sense of intimacy between herself and the audience member based on shared knowledge and a sincere willingness to actually go there. Garland, by referencing the criticism, diffuses it, defiantly robbing critics of their ability to harm her with their words. The next track provides another perfect example. Garland goes directly into her next song, a medley combining two Broadway hits, Almost Like Being in Love by musical theater duo Lerner and Loewe for the 1947 musical Brigadoon, and This Can't Be Love, written by Richard Rodgers and Lorenz Hart for the 1938 musical The Boys from Syracuse. After this medley, she finally talks to the crowd.
I'm so excited, my goodness.
Here, she launches into a story about her recent European tour, where she visited with a particularly chic French friend of hers.
She said, you must go to my hairdresser, because obviously you need somebody. So she arranged.
So she goes to this hairdresser the woman recommends, and he builds up a tall hairstyle that's much higher than anything she could have anticipated.
I walked out balancing my hair. and
her hair melts from the lights and her sweat, and she's left with a sloppy mess on her head. Stories like this, and jokes like the stout joke, are at the heart of what formed Judy Garland's star persona since its earliest days. Within the stable of MGM stars, Garland was most often framed in contrast to the studio's more glamorous figures. She wasn't clothed in elegant gowns like Joan Crawford. She wasn't a mysterious deity like Greta Garbo. She wasn't the object of lust like Jean Harlow. She was more of the typical girl next door. Her characters had to blossom into their own, plucked from obscurity and lifted into success by hard work and pure talent. She might lose out on her crush to Lana Turner, but she would make a joke out of it, and by the end of the film, you'd be rooting for her. MGM would never let her look truly silly or humiliated, but her being in silly situations, scrambling to keep composure, were consistently part of the joke. In an era where many stars were treated with reverence and frequently sought that reverence by peacocking the illusion of perfection, Garland went the opposite direction. As she did on screen, she insisted on emphasizing her normality, or what scholar Richard Dyer termed her ordinariness in his book Heavenly Bodies. She sweated, she gained weight, and everybody could laugh about it on her terms after they paid a bunch of money to see her perform at the nation's foremost concert venue. The story Judy tells at Carnegie Hall may or may not be a true story. I'd wager not. It varied from concert to concert.
I arrived there and they sent me to a very famous, terribly chic hairdresser.
But it means something that this is the kind of story she wanted to tell to entertain her audience. It's essentially a stand-up set performed by an expert in self-deprecation who doesn't see herself on the pedestal her superstar status might ordinarily suggest that she resides on. Jokes like this run throughout all of the talking tracks on the album, like,
I don't know why it is that I can't perspire. I just sweat. So unladylike.
the hair appointment story gets a punchline with the opening of her next song. George Gershwin and Buddy DeSilva, one of the founders of Capitol Records, wrote the song Do It Again for the 1922 Broadway show The French Doll. This wasn't the first time Garland performed Do It Again. It appeared on her 1958 album, Judy in Love. That version begins with the original lyrics and a quicker tempo.
Do it again. I may say no, 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 no.
The Carnegie Hall arrangement begins with a new verse and dramatically slows the tempo, transforming it into a deeply romantic, intimate piece that shows off a different facet of her skill set.
Do it again.
As John Wilson wrote in the New York Times, there are basically two sides to Miss Garland as a singer: the lusty-voiced belter, craftily adept at theatrical type of projection, and the easy, casual singer who works on intimate terms with her audience. This is the latter. The song is also an excellent study in the way different performance styles and orchestrations affect the mood of a song. Consider, for example, that probably the second most famous performance of this song was done by Marilyn Monroe at a USO show at Camp Pendleton. The same lyric in Marilyn's hands feels completely different.
Won't regret it. Come and get it.
Won't regret it. Come and get it.
The tenderness of Judy's rendition is a standout for me on the album. Sure, the audience can relate to the awkwardness of a bad haircut, but they can also connect to the quietness and honesty of this performance that so earnestly communicates a vulnerability usually only expressed in private. After Do It Again's piercing intimacy, we land firmly back in the land of the standard American songbook with You Go to My Head, another song she had recently recorded in her London sessions. This track is primarily remembered for Garland's brief slip of memory.
You go to my head and I forgot the goddamn words.
She tries to save herself with an inelegant scat-adjacent string of nonsense words before finally finding the lyric again.
Where's the honey sympathies you have found? You intoxicate my soul with your eyes.
As hard as it may be to admit, Judy at Carnegie Hall is not technically a perfectly sung album. By this point in her life, Garland showed signs of vocal damage that occasionally peeked through in her performances. And unlike albums today, these cracks or wobbles were not smoothed into oblivion or erased in post. But for many Garland fans, that was kind of the point. For the woman who had embodied the mighty underdog in films and real life for years, imperfection equaled authenticity. In reviews throughout her tour, critics pointed out the strain in her voice, but framed it as a feature, not a bug, of the event, texture that added emotional depth to her delivery. Her voice is shaky at times, almost tremulous, and then big, blaring, brassy. Yet to the audience, each note is personally touching. Another paper remarked, the voice doesn't quite have the lilt it once possessed. The body is somewhat dumpy, but the brilliant, tremulous smile is the same. The emotional depth has been doubled, and the yearning, the unique yearning that Judy gets into her voice, has reached the point of infinity. A lapse in memory, though a quote-unquote mistake, isn't quite the same thing as a vocal stumble, however. Garland was known to have trouble remembering things. There are outtakes of the Judy Garland show that prove as much. But then again, as friend of the channel Lipsinka pointed out, the closer you look, this particular lapse in memory recurred in the same spot throughout her tour.
With a smile that
I always forget these words. When I forgot the gall darn words. When I forgot the gall darn words.
Either this was an especially difficult lyric to remember, perhaps because the tempo in the live version was significantly faster than the original recording, or it's a bit, a play on the imperfections, a play on her reputation for unreliability. Both are frankly believable to me. Alone Together was composed by Arthur Schwartz with lyrics by Howard Dietz, a man who had an absolutely fascinating career as both a highly successful lyricist and also one of the most important publicity men in Hollywood, serving as MGM's director of advertising and publicity. The guy who wrote the lyrics for The Bandwagon also came up with Leo the Lion, like the MGM Lion. Anyway, Schwartz and Dietz wrote this song for the 1932 Broadway musical Flying Colors, and it eventually became a jazz standard sung by the usual suspects, including Judy Garland, who recorded a version for her album That's Entertainment. Her recording at Carnegie Hall is broadly the same as that version, although there was a conspiracy theory for years that she had actually messed up on the night of the concert and re-recorded it for the album release because it was the one track on the original that didn't line up correctly from track to track. Breedwell debunks that too. Garland started the song standing slightly too far away from the microphone, and then the tape ran out mid-song on Capitol's main recorder. Both problems were easily solved. On Capitol's definitive CD issue, released at the time of the 40th anniversary in 2001, the volume level was adjusted and a backup tape with the complete performance of Alone Together was utilized. So now, everything plays smoothly from You Go to My Head into Alone Together, and everything's fine. At the end of the track, Garland gives us more banter.
If I'm known at all, I'm known for singing very sad, tragic songs or just marches and holiday songs.
But, she adds, setting up the next section,
I do like to sing jazz, and they won't let me. I don't know who they are, but they won't let me.
This, she says, is her opportunity to do more straightforward jazz renditions, so she gathers a small section of the band for the next few songs. Who Cares is another new arrangement of a Broadway hit from the 1930s, Of Thee I Sing, with music and lyrics by George and Ira Gershwin. In fact, the next three songs were all written in the 1920s and 30s. Puttin' on the Ritz is a 1927 song by Irving Berlin that Clark Gable once performed in a film.
Bangles dance upon the bevy of high bounds down the levee, all dismissed.
He was not good. She follows this with How Long Has This Been Going On, again by George and Ira Gershwin for the 1927 musical Funny Face, which also appears on That's Entertainment. Finally, Just You, Just Me, which was written for the 1929 musical film Marianne, starring Marion Davies. These songs go by really quickly, but represent another broad theme of the concert: nostalgia. Manuel Betancourt points out in his 33 1/3 book on the concert that of the 28 songs that make up Judy at Carnegie Hall, only 2 were written in the 1950s. More than half, in fact, date to the 1920s and 30s, through the Great American Songbook. Garland came from vaudeville, the studio system, a time in which musical theater ruled the box office, when pop music came primarily from Broadway, and her set list purposely indulges in these roots. She isn't interested in a new arrangement of a contemporary pop hit like Runaway by Del Shannon. She means to evoke a past era, to draw a through line from the origins of pop music to the present, the complicated implications of which we'll talk about more in a minute. That this concert occurred in 1961 is interesting in and of itself, a year that seemed to represent a kind of pivot point in culture, symbolically cleaving the 20th century in two. John F. Kennedy was sworn in as president and initiated an escalation of the Vietnam War. The studio system had all but abandoned the Hays Code that censored immoral content in films. To give you an idea of how divided the music industry was by two halves of a century, at the Grammys that year, 80-year-old Stravinsky won for Best Classical Album of the Year, while Chubby Checker won for Let's Twist Again. Concertgoers in 1961 would have understood Garland as a nostalgic act. The word appears again and again in articles about her work. Her singing style, often seems to be associated more with the past than the present. It conveys a period feeling. John Wilson wrote in the New York Times about her Carnegie Hall concert. The New York Times review of the Met Show, which more explicitly utilized vaudevillian tropes, said, "The ritual in this sort of show inevitably calls for nostalgia, a sentimental jog to memory of the younger and brighter days. Miss Garland is indulging in the ritual to the fullest." As you might imagine, pop music also became the 1961 equivalent of a culture war issue. As pop culture moved toward Elvis Presley and Tina Turner, there were obviously folks who yearned for the good old songwriting of yesteryear. As one disgruntled concertgoer put it, perhaps it was unfamiliarity or old age or lack of associations, but I'm believing what I read, that the composition of good pop music is a dying art. What's more fun than hearing some great old tune, pegging it in time, and remembering with a pang of the people you knew and loved in 1944, the things you were doing in 1949 or 1953. This sort of thing you can enjoy with Judy Garland's music. But how in heaven will today's teenagers be able to get all dewy-eyed remembering the antics of Elvis and the other oily-haired young men who sing such awful songs? If the show is partly about looking back in time, it was also about looking back in time at Judy's filmography. The next song is the first in the show that directly dips into that work. The Man That Got Away was written for the 1954 film A Star Is Born, with lyrics by Ira Gershwin and music by Harold Arlen. Arlen was perhaps Garland's most important composer, having written Get Happy and Over the Rainbow, in addition to several other standards she covered throughout the years. He was there that night too. She even calls him out at one point.
Harold, darling, stand up.
This number in A Star Is Born is iconic. It's the scene in which Norman Maine really listens to the yet-to-be-famous Esther Blodgett sing for the first time after drunkenly interrupting her show earlier in the evening. Because this song was originated by Judy Garland, the music was essentially already tailored to her skills as a performer. It tells a story, allowing her to act through the song. It's big, emotional. The Carnegie Hall version doesn't have to do much to make the song even bigger, and yet it achieves this with very simple changes. This version has a slightly slower tempo and a prominent use of strings that gives the song a more wistful quality than in the film, where it needed to believably pass for a jazz band playing in a dingy bar after hours. Where the film gently eases in the brass, the concert version wants to smack you in the face with it, and it's absolutely sickening. The song is like a bomb going off, just explosive with heartache. Garland also demonstrates that she knows when and how to deploy weakness to great effect. In the film, this is a practice performance for a group of friends. She ends the song in a relatively positive mood, another successful exercise for the team. At Carnegie Hall, she allows the performance to better match the lyric. She's sad, regretful, grieving, like this version from the Judy Garland show.
The man that gone
It's a touching performance that brings to mind this quote from film historian Richard Chickle. At her finest, Miss Garland, especially in her maturity, seems always about to be destroyed by her own inner forces. It puts a quiver of passion in her voice and a chill in the listener's spine. At every moment of a Garland performance, you feel that you stand with the star on the brink of disaster, and 100 times a night she saves herself and her sympathetic admirers from the abyss. Songs like this were Garland's bread and butter, both technically as one of the great belters of entertainment history and thematically. Romantic yearning was a staple of young Judy's repertoire, writes Betancourt. The tragedy Garland so carefully evoked in her singing was always about heartache. She had, as she often joked, plenty of experience in the matter. It's true, most of the showstoppers on the album deal with themes like the man that got away, at least except for the finale of Act 1. San Francisco was written for the 1936 film San Francisco that takes place in the aftermath of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, starring Jeanette MacDonald and Clark Gable. Roger Edens again provided Garland with a newly written prologue that functions much the way the patter section does in When You're Smiling. It turns a rather straightforward musical ode to a city into a musical comedy number that plays with the audience's prior knowledge. She begins,
I never will forget Jeanette MacDonald.
Of course, in reference to the 1936 film. Jeanette MacDonald, like Garland, was a star of movie musicals, though she and Garland had very different star personas. An ingenue who sang in an operatic soprano, she became known for her films with baritone Nelson Eddy, in which they constantly crooned love songs at each other. In San Francisco, MacDonald sings this song what seems like 1,000,000 times, and the orchestration has maybe 2% of the vivacity of Judy's. Garland's new prologue pokes fun at this kind of corny, repetitive, operatic love song.
And sang, and sang.
Critic Andrew Saris later wrote that Jeanette MacDonald's fans were less than thrilled about this. This song might not seem like an intuitive closer for Act 1 at first, particularly following one of her most famous songs, but Garland's energy is undeniable in this number, and watching the footage of her sing it, one does get the sense that she really did love performing it. She's extremely animated and makes some of the most clever, entertaining choices in the entire show. This is my favorite. Listening to this song, this 4'11" woman becomes the theater, just an enormous, all-encompassing presence. It's an effervescent end to the first act, leaving the audience eagerly awaiting what's in store. The second act opens with That's Entertainment, written for the 1953 musical The Bandwagon, with music by Arthur Schwartz and lyrics by Howard Dietz. The song became an anthem of sorts for MGM, employed as a nostalgic throwback tune representing the golden age of Hollywood. In the 1950s, it was used as a theme song for the television show MGM Parade, which essentially just showed clips of old MGM films.
The MGM Parade, brought to you this week by Pell Mell, famous cigarettes.
A compilation film in 1974 that broadly did the same thing with MGM, also used it as a title. Garland, the face of MGM musicals for many years, also selected the songs as the titular track for her 1960 album. The song's a slightly odd one, positing that you could really make entertainment out of anything. The world is a stage after all, which probably means you can predict exactly how Todd Phillips is going to use it in Joker 2. Garland takes its message to a personal level, following her performance with a story about how a reporter in London who'd been very, very nice to her in person, going on and on about how well she looked, only to publish a story the next day with the headline,
Judy Garland arrives in London, and she's not chubby, and she's not plump, she's fat.
That's certainly not news. That's entertainment. What more could Judy give? I Can't Give You Anything But Love, with music and lyrics by Jimmy McHugh and Dorothy Fields, was first sung by Adelaide Hall in 1928 and later included in the Broadway show Blackbirds of 1928. The song was recorded multiple times throughout the 1930s and 40s and appeared in multiple films.
I can't give you anything but love, baby.
Gee, I like to see you looking swell. baby. Ba-boom. Ba-boom, boom. Do you mind?
But most famously was sung by Lena Horne in the 1943 film Stormy Weather. Garland is again given new lyrics to add a theatrical meta touch to her version. She sings that it's someone's birthday, but she can't afford a single present.
I'm much too broke, I find. But there is...
This is a clear nod to Garland's financial troubles, but it's also an odd addition in a sense. Although it's not typically sung as part of the standard, there is a prologue to the song that includes a line about being broke, and it's unclear why that version is not used.
Gee, but it's tough to be broke, kid. It's not a joke, kid. It's a curse.
Garland's version, much like Do It Again in the first act, uses a much slower tempo than is usually performed. It's such a bouncy melody, but Garland gives it a melancholy touch, transforming the song from a defiant, happy-go-lucky in the face of poverty tune to something elegantly mournful.
I can't give you anything but love, baby.
Where the filmed version takes a typical MGM approach, furnishing Horne with a gilded gown and filling the instrumental break with a dance sequence.
I can't give you anything but love.
In her television performances, Judy dispenses with her energetic roaming of the stage to dreamily, pensively remain still during the instrumental break. The next song picks up the mood. Come Rain or Come Shine was written for the 1946 musical St. Louis Woman by Harold Arlen and Johnny Mercer, another founder of Capitol Records. The song was originated by Della Green in a cast that included Pearl Bailey and Harold Nicholas of the tap dancing duo the Nicholas Brothers. Garland's version here swings with a heavy conga presence, a lively pick-me-up after her somber version of I Can't Give You Anything But Love. So lively, in fact, she ends the track with the banter.
I think after all of that insanity, that we should calm down.
Garland invites the audience to join her for a short collection of 3 songs accompanied solely by Mort Lindsay on the piano. First, You're Nearer by Richard Rodgers and Lorenz Hart for the 1940 film Too Many Girls, where it's lip-synced by Lucille Ball.
You're nearer than my head is to my pillow.
Next, A Foggy Day, written by George and Ira Gershwin for the 1937 film A Damsel in Distress. And finally, If Love Were All, written by Noel Coward. Garland takes the time to introduce 2 of these 3 songs, worrying that either the audience had either not heard of them or that they might be bored by simple piano accompaniment. These songs aren't the most famous standards, nor are they recognizable hits from her films, so that she takes the time to introduce them specifically suggests that she likes them. They're here because she wants to sing them, not because they're crowd pleasers she's obligated to include. With that in mind, the final line of If Love Were All hits like a ton of bricks.
But I believe that since my life began, the most I've had is just a talent to amuse.
What follows is one of the most jarring transitions in the concert. We go right from that gut-wrenching lyric that reflects on a life spent entertaining others into Zing Went the Strings of My Heart, a song Judy Garland had been singing since she was 12 years old, and according to Friedwald, was apparently part of her audition for MGM.
Now, the little lady standing here beside me isn't exactly a celebrity yet. She's only 12 years old. She probably won't be famous, maybe for a couple of years. Her name is Judy Garland. And I'm sure that you remember her singing here about 4 weeks ago. Well, since her last appearance here, she signed a 7-year contract with the MGM studio. Isn't that great? Gosh.
She later sang the song for the studio in the 1938 film Listen, Darling. These clips juxtapose in such an interesting way. The preteen Garland is so raw and seemingly uncomfortable, at least compared to the highly experienced, warm performer we see decades later holding the audience in the palm of her hand.
Of spring, I heard a robin sing about her nest set apart. All nature seemed to be in perfect harmony. Zing went the strings of my heart.
That skill, holding the audience in the palm of her hand, is on display in the next track. Stormy Weather was written by Harold Arlen and Ted Koehler for Ethel Waters, who originally premiered it at the famous Harlem nightclub, the Cotton Club, in 1933. The songstress most often associated with the song, however, was Lena Horne, who sang it in the 1943 film of the same name, one of the only movies from a major studio with an all-black cast in the 1940s. Garland had been singing the song for years before finally recording it as part of her London sessions, which is the version she sings at Carnegie Hall. There are no additional lyrics to her version, but her arrangement differs so drastically that it almost feels like a different song altogether. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Stormy Weather is perhaps the best example on the album of Garland's arrangements matching her ability to act a song. The introduction is bold, but it quickly peels back to reveal a forlorn Judy. The horns moan in the background as she smartly softens her voice to express her weariness.
Gloom and misery everywhere. Stormy weather.
The volume and the strings become more defiant as she pleads with the heavens.
All I do is pray that the Lord above will let me walk in the sun once more.
And just when everything drops and you expect a huge belt of emotion, she weeps.
Can't go. Everything I had is gone. Stormy weather.
Soon the anger sets in.
Can't go.
Exhaustion leads to a final release.
Keeps raining all the
Every emotion conveyed by Garland in this song feels earned by years of heartache. Men who disappointed her romantically, men who stole all her money, journalists who giddily chronicled every detail for the world to read as her body broke down under the weight of it all. It's an extraordinary performance that perfectly illustrates the sense of drama and self-reflection unique to Garland's concert style. She follows this with a medley including a trio of songs from her films. She sang You Made Me Love You in the 1937 film Broadway Melody of 1938. That performance set a major precedent for her career because, yes, Roger Edens wrote additional lyrics way back then too. A verse from the perspective of a fan writing to Clark Gable. Friedwald notes that MGM released the song as a B-side in 1939, opposite Garland's recording of Over the Rainbow from The Wizard of Oz. For Me and My Gal is the titular song from For Me and My Gal, which she performs with Gene Kelly, and does some of the worst fake piano playing I've ever seen. This was also released as a single and was a major hit in 1942. And finally, the Trolley Song from the 1944 film Meet Me in St. Louis. A year or so ago, the Trolley Song became a bit of a meme online.
Clang, clang, clang went the trolley. Ding, ding, ding went the bell.
And to be honest, this isn't even an exaggeration. Everyone went absolutely feral for the Trolley Song in 1944. It is difficult to understate how extremely popular that song was. Like, it was to the point that 5 different versions of the song charted in 1944 and 1945.
Clang, clang, clang went the trolley. Ding, ding, ding went the bell.
Ding, ding, ding went my heartstrings. For the moment I saw him, I fell.
Of the 3 songs in this medley, the Trolley Song was the only one specifically written for Garland. The others had roots in another artist she was often compared to, an artist who originated the next song on the album, Al Jolson. You Made Me Love You, For Me and My Gal, Rockabye Your Baby with a Dixie Melody, and Swanee, which she sings as an encore at Carnegie Hall, were all either originated by or popularized by Al Jolson, a singer and actor who is primarily remembered today as the most prominent purveyor of blackface in American entertainment. Today, we rightly condemn his routine as a racist act that caricatures and dehumanizes Black people through exaggerated stereotypes. This, unfortunately, was not how he was received in the early 20th century, when his blackface act made him one of the most popular performers of the era and earned him the moniker the world's greatest entertainer. Because Jolson was known for his unique singing style and so-called musical comedy, and because Jolson was really the first figure to blend the role of movie star and recording artist, Judy Garland was often characterized as the heir apparent to Jolson's title of world's greatest entertainer, and her films made overt references to Jolson to foster that connection. Most jarring, MGM put her in blackface as a child in films patterned after the popular minstrel shows performed by Jolson. More subtle were the post-war homages to vaudeville, like the Born in a Trunk sequence from 1954's A Star is Born. As Brian Currid points out in his article, Judy Garland's American Drag, Garland sings one of Jolson's greatest hits, Swanee, and is dressed with a top hat, a jacket and tie, and white gloves. Her costume is a stylized version of the Jolson attire. Although blackface was generally abandoned in mainstream popular entertainment by 1961, Jolson remained a beloved cultural figure in white America, and tributes to him during this time were anything but taboo. Currid explains, by the early 1950s, Jolson's blackface was a central figure of nostalgia in American mass culture, not only due to its role in the history of cinema familiar to 50s audiences from the 1951 film Singin' in the Rain, but also in relation to the very popular new Jolson films of the late 1940s, The Al Jolson Story and Jolson Sings Again, the latter being the top-grossing film of 1949. Although Garland's performance at Carnegie Hall makes no overt gesture to Jolson, other than singing some of his greatest hits, Rockabye Baby and Swanee among them, Currid is absolutely correct in his article to interrogate the function of nostalgia, particularly when it evokes an era that so prominently featured racist tropes. Betancourt, I think, expresses the implications of choosing these songs best. Swanee encapsulates what makes Judy at Carnegie Hall such a quintessentially American classic. Its nostalgia, mired as it is in blackface entertainment and minstrelsy, works hand in hand with Garland's effervescent performance to create a document about a country's backward-looking gaze, forever yearning for a past that existed only in its own imagination. Garland packaged nostalgia for an entire generation of Americans who were all too eager to smile alongside her, forgetting not only their troubles, but the questionable cultural ones this song's history cannot help but shore up alongside the dreamy river it so exalts. Rockabye Baby is the ostensible end to the concert, but of course there's no way Garland's going home yet. The audience demands more, encore after encore, until she eventually exhausts the sheet music her band has available. She begins with the perennial favorite, Over the Rainbow, which I don't feel I need to get into as it's easily the most famous and accessible of her songs. This rendition is worth listening to, however, as it reads completely different on the other side of several decades worth of ups and downs. Lyrics that sound aspirational and hopeful, sung by a teenager, sound despairing and fatigued coming from an adult Judy. Then comes Swanee, then After You're Gone, a standard written in 1918 and sung by virtually everyone, including Barbra Streisand and Judy Garland in their Hooray for Love medley on The Judy Garland Show.
After you gone and left me crying. After you gone.
By now, the audience is clamoring for more. Judy still sounds fresh and seemingly able to continue all night if she could. But she ends finally with Chicago, another 1922 song with special lyrics by Roger Edens. It's by no means the best song in the show, but the end of this album, to me, is overwhelmingly thrilling. The band tries to play her off like 3 or 4 times with an instrumental version of Over the Rainbow. And over the music, you can just hear the cheers and applause from the audience, completely overwhelming the space. You're forced to imagine how electric that room must have felt. I mean, this is really what it's all about, isn't it? There's something about digging into the history of something that is so intangible. I can read you the stats about how well the album sold. I can try to convey with numbers how popular something was, or quote reviews, but somehow that always seems insufficient to understand what a performance feels like and means. Hearing the love in these final moments makes everything feel alive suddenly. If Judy articulates our innermost emotions through her performances on this album, then these fans also articulate our emotions by communicating the appreciation we have for an artist that we cannot cheer for ourselves. That is a profound connection to make across time. News immediately rang out. Judy Garland at Carnegie Hall was a rousing success. New York Times review waxed poetic about her ability to connect with the audience. Looking trimmer and a good deal more youthful than she has in years, Miss Garland was always in control of herself. She soothed the tender songs as only she knows how to soothe tender songs, and she projected the loud ones with all the vigor at her command, always making her audience feel, as one listener remarked, as if she's just singing to you. Variety echoed, "Few singers around can get as much out of a song as Miss Garland. Everything she's got goes into them, and she's got plenty. The tones are clear, the phrasing is meaningful, and the vocal passion is catching." To some observers, it was akin to witnessing a kind of religious experience. The religious ritual of reading, watching, and listening to Judy Garland took place last night in Carnegie Hall. Indeed, what actually was to have been a concert, and was, also turned into something not too remote from a revival meeting. At the end of each song, the audience, in a religious-like fervor, applauds, cries, and shouts. "We love you, Judy, we love you." The aisles were jammed during the encore turns, applauding her every curtsy and even saluting her 3 children, who were lifted on the stage by Rock Hudson, who had a first-row seat with appreciative cheers. The XOXO Gossip Girls, Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, both claimed they had never seen anything like it in their lives. Hopper wrote, "Judy Garland took a jam-packed audience in Carnegie Hall in her arms, and they hugged her right back. Never saw the like in my life." Parsons added, "If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed an audience could get so hysterically excited, cheer and screamed, and try to rush up as they did at the Judy Garland concert at Carnegie Hall. The pictures prove as much." It's worth noting that by this point, Garland was known to have a prominent gay following, and that too was frequently mentioned in reviews of her concerts, although rarely in explicit terms. Instead, most journalists opted for coded language, often with a condescending tone, like, "It's too bad that the cultists have taken over, indeed absconded with, the Judy Garland legend, which has turned into a catty little clique of ecstatic young men in denims and fluffy pullover sweaters." The concept of diva worship and Judy Garland's role as a gay icon has evolved over time, from acceptance to rejection of it as a kind of cringy pastiche, to insisting her death prompted the Stonewall riots, to course-correcting that because it absolutely didn't. But it's undeniably true that this album is filled with adoration and has lived on in part because of the gay men who enjoyed it. And if you want to read more about that, I would suggest picking up pretty much anything by Richard Dyer, who's written extensively on this topic since the 1970s, or Manuel Betancourt's 33 and a Third book, which thoroughly digs into this topic and is generally fantastic. The album was released in July 1961 and received similarly glowing reviews. Those of you who are Judy Garland fans must own this album, and anybody who is looking for a wonderful recorded entertainment should also have it. "I've never been a Garland nut, but I keep listening to these two records," said one journalist. Another wrote, "She is more than an idol. She is one of the great singers of popular songs. This recording is a remarkable performance. Taken as a whole, in fact, it strikes me as the greatest Judy Garland performance I've ever heard, topping by sheer quantity the soundtrack of A Star Is Born. If you ever liked a Judy Garland performance, you ought to own this album." And people definitely bought it. Judy at Carnegie Hall charted for 73 weeks on the Billboard charts, including 13 weeks at number 1. Placed number 1 on the pop album charts and stayed there for 199 weeks. It was the fastest selling 2-disc album in history. And it won 4 Grammys: Best Solo Vocal Performance, Best Engineering Contribution of a Popular Recording, Best Album Cover, and Album of the Year, making Judy Garland the first ever female artist to win that award. The album has never been out of print since 1961. For Garland, her tour, but more specifically the success of her performance at Carnegie Hall, was a resounding affirmation of her star power and talent. It was the comeback Freddie Fields had planned for, a triumph over naysayers who assumed her career was done for. It was even the fulfillment of a prophecy for older fans who could remember her singing in 1943's Thousands Cheer,
You know the joint is really jumping down at Carnegie Hall.
a song that actually is a great illustration of culture shifting with time. The song talks about swing displacing classical music in the legendary venue as a new exciting art form.
Instead of Strauss, they play Irving Berlin. Instead of Brahms, it's Begin to Begin. Those classic khakis are due for a fall, cause the joint is really jumping down at Carnegie Hall.
Judy would become another one of those swinging acts, shifting the culture of Carnegie Hall, while also representing a nostalgic act herself, a generation of pop artists soon to be displaced by rock. The success of the concert signaled the start of a new era for the star. The concert encouraged CBS to settle its outstanding disputes with Garland and signed her for a series of new television specials. Her 1962 TV special with Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra recycled a lot of material from Carnegie Hall, many of the clips I've played in this video, and was a smash hit. Another special with Phil Silvers and Robert Goulet followed in 1963, as well as her short-lived television variety show that ran from 1963 to 1964. Her performance in Judgment at Nuremberg was also widely praised. The film received 10 Academy Award nominations, including Judy Garland for Best Supporting Actress, although she lost to Rita Moreno's incredible turn as Anita in West Side Story. Film critic Andrew Sarris once called Judy Garland one of the earliest cautionary figures of Hollywood horror folklore. And I admit that on this channel, I've often fallen into the trap of outlining her sorrows and struggles rather than the qualities that made her special as a performer. I hope this video corrects that. 1960 through 1962 were certainly high points of Judy Garland's career, a positive streak that gave us a glimpse of what a happy, healthy Judy Garland might have gone on to do had she been allowed to remain that way. Mort Lindsay told Vanity Fair that he didn't think she took drugs at all during the 1961 tour, while her daughter Florina Luft offered a more tempered assessment that she was as sober as she could be. There were more financial troubles down the line, more bad relationships, more suffering, But there will always be this album, a snapshot of Garland at her best and most captivating. So is this the greatest night in entertainment history? As if that's a possible thing to answer. Who knows? Maybe. There's as good an argument for this as there is for anything else. I sure would make the argument. Hopefully this video has convinced you to check out the album if you haven't already, or revisit it if it's been a while. If the concert itself is an exercise in nostalgia, then that is also certainly the case now, when listening to music has become a much more fractured act, dictated by playlists and algorithms. It's rare, at least in my experience, to sit down and listen to an album in full and really pay attention to what it's trying to do. Of course, I say this like the day after an album drops that demands exactly that. But when researching for this video, I really did just sit down and play it straight through, doing nothing else but listen, which felt almost as nostalgic and outdated an act as vaudeville must have felt to audiences in the 1960s. But that is the way I'd recommend listening if you can. You'll begin to appreciate the details that put you in the room, like where she goes to get a sip of water after Do It Again, and you can just hear her heels clacking on the stage as she walks around. For me, these innocuous moments that don't feel like they belong in an album make the experience special and remind me that this is a thing that actually happened as it happened, a moment people lived. If you like this video and are interested in supporting the channel, since this video will most definitely be demonetized, please consider checking out my Patreon, where I offer perks like polls for future videos and access to exclusive content. Okay, so once you've finished feasting on the audible delight of Judy at Carnegie Hall, it's time to indulge in something really visually stimulating. And may I suggest the short films of Susan Pitt. Trained as a painter in the 1960s, Pitt became known for luscious, handmade, animated films that used surrealist, dreamlike imagery that revels in the sticky corners of the psychosexual imaginary. Her films are an absolute trip, sensuous, bizarre, colorful, open to interpretation. Asparagus, which took her 4 years to hand paint, by the way, addresses so much in just 18 minutes. Gender, identity, the role of art is the kind of work that makes me excited about animation again, and reminds me that it's a deeply underrated medium and not limited to like whatever Pixar movie is winning an Oscar this year. And you can watch these films right now for free on Mubi. Mubi is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from all around the globe. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there's always something new to discover. With Mubi, each and every film is hand-selected by a wonderfully talented team of curators. You can discover the best of cinema at your fingertips, anytime, anywhere. With a diverse library that includes not only filmmakers like Pitt, but also James Ivory, Barry Jenkins, and Justine Triet on demand, Mubi truly makes being a cinephile easy and exciting. Thankfully, because Mubi is sponsoring this video, you can check out all of these films right now for free. All you have to do is click the link in my description below. Just go to mubi.com/BeKindRewind for a whole month free. Access a world of cinema with just one click. Get your month free at mubi.com/BeKindRewind.